Hello, this is Zach Coda, teacher naturalist with North Branch Nature Center. This program is part of a series on amphibian ecology, and it overviews the salamanders of Vermont. Here in Vermont, we're lucky to have several different families of salamanders represented in our state. We have several species of mole salamanders that live primarily underground and reproduce in vernal pools. We have several species of the lungless salamanders, some of which are terrestrial, a few others that live in fast-flowing streams. We have one species of newt, and we have the mud puppy. In the northeastern United States, we have a fairly good diversity of salamanders compared to global salamander diversity. But just a little ways south of us is the brightest hotspot of salamander diversity on the planet, the Southern Appalachians. If you go to places like the Great Smoky Mountains, you'll find lots of different salamanders, including some that are rather rare, whose ranges may only be confined to a few certain mountaintops. So even though we have quite a few different salamanders in Vermont, and it's a great place for finding these animals, just a little way south of us is even better. This just showcases some of the amazing salamanders found along the Appalachians, all the way from southern Georgia into the northeast where we are in Vermont. Some of these species, like spotted salamander and redback salamander and four-toed salamander, are found here in Vermont, while others, like the eastern hellbender, are found a little bit further west and south of us, and others are found in the southern Appalachians. But all of these species are found somewhere along the Appalachian Mountains, and only a few days' drive from us here in Vermont. The first salamander I want to show you is perhaps one of the most easily identifiable and one of the most charismatic, the spotted salamander. Spotted salamanders are one of our mole salamander species, and it's one of the larger salamanders found here in Vermont. Adult spotted salamanders are long and have heavy bodies. They have a rather broad head and that big mouth and those big bulging eyes that come out of either side on top of their head. Their upper body, the top of their body is rather black, and the underside can be more of a dark gray. And they all have these rows of bright yellow spots on the back. And in some areas, those spots are actually orange on top of their head. If you were to flip one over during the breeding season, you can tell which is a male versus which one is a female, because the vent, where the cloaca is, just behind the rear legs, will be swollen in a male. Their egg masses are this sort of oblong, round shape, about 6 to 8 inches long, and can have anywhere from 500 to 250 eggs in it. And a female may lay 3 or 4 egg masses in a given season. Younger females may lay smaller egg masses and fewer of them, while the oldest females are laying the most eggs in a given season. The eggs are tightly bunched together in this mass, and the whole mass of eggs is surrounded by this thick outer matrix, so that if you pick it up out of the water, the whole mass holds its shape, kind of has a squishy, firm texture. This egg mass can either be transparent or clear, or it can be this milky white color, or it may even have a greenish tint, which happens from algae actually growing within the membrane around the egg. Spotted salamanders, amazingly, are one of the only vertebrates that we know of that has a plant that actually grows inside of it. The eggs have these algae that grow inside of the egg, and the algae are able to create oxygen, and the eggs actually take in the oxygen emitted by the algae. It's this amazing thing, and some studies have even shown that the adult salamanders may retain some of the algae in their cells. So this is an example of a plant living inside the cells of a vertebrate animal. There are two types of larvae that we'll talk about when we're looking at salamander larvae, and the mole salamanders have what we call pond-type larvae, which are characterized by really big, wide heads, much narrower, longer bodies, and these big fan-like gills that come out of either side of the head. After they have been in the larval stage, they're going to go through a metamorphosis into a terrestrial juvenile. These juveniles or metamorphs look like very small black salamanders, probably about 3 inches long, and they don't yet have their spots. They'll gain their spots as they metamorphose again, as they reach sexual maturity. Adults are spending the winter underground, down below the frost line, usually in small rodent tunnels. And then in the spring, when it rains, it gets a little bit warmer, and the snow starts to melt, the adults are migrating overland to vernal pools and other wetlands that don't have any fish, because the fish will eat the eggs. And here in Vermont, that's usually late March through mid-April. When they get to these vernal pools, they're going through these amazing, elaborate courtship rituals. The males are dancing and courting the females and using pheromones to attract the females. The males are going to lay a spermatophore, that little egg packet that's shown in the middle photo there. It's attached to a twig or something in the bottom of the pool, some vegetation in the bottom of the pool. On top of that spermatophore, the white part is actually the sperm packet, and underneath it is some other protein. And it's shown that females are able to gauge the spermatophores. So the male is guiding the female to the spermatophore, and she's looking at it. And some studies show that the female can absorb the proteins in the sperm packet. They can actually help her when she is getting ready to lay eggs. And so they may judge the sperm packets, and if she likes it, she's going to pick it up with her cloaca. She might use it right away to fertilize her eggs, or she can actually store that sperm packet and use it later. Oftentimes, individual adult salamanders are coming back to the same pool to breed year after year. In the upper left photo, you're seeing an egg mass. You can see the individual eggs and then that kind of off-white vitelline membrane around each egg, and then that thick outer jelly matrix around the whole thing. Often it's attached, like you see there, to some aquatic vegetation. Once they hatch out of the eggs, the larvae are swimming around their pool and eating whatever they can fit in their mouths. They're starting out by eating little zooplankton, and then they're graduating up to larger invertebrates, oftentimes insect larvae. They may even eat other amphibian larvae, so if there are wood frog tadpoles, they may eat those, and they may even eat each other as they run out of other prey in their vernal pool. Once they metamorphose and go on to land, the juveniles are eating things like earthworms and spiders and millipedes, and they're dispersing as well during their juvenile phase and maybe wandering over land for the first couple of years when they're not breeding and finding new areas where they may breed. And then once they reach their adult phase, they're able to eat larger prey, and all of the juveniles and adults are overwintering underground, again, often in those small rodent tunnels. Spotted salamanders are found just about statewide, and you can see there are only a few towns where they have yet to be documented, but it's likely that they are indeed found in every single town in the state. They just haven't been documented in a few towns. And just like human fingerprints can be used to tell individuals apart, spotted salamanders have a unique spot pattern. And so you can find individuals year after year returning to the same vernal pool by mapping out their spot pattern or taking a picture and comparing their spot pattern. And it's possible that in the future we'll be able to use some sort of artificial intelligence to look through photos and find if the same individuals are indeed returning to the same site year after year. These photos were taken as part of a project run by Harris Center for Environmental Conservation in New Hampshire, and they were able to show some amazing things about site fidelity, so adults returning to the same site year after year, and also just how long spotted salamanders live for. The next largest mole salamander that we have here in Vermont is the Jefferson salamander. It's similar to the spotted salamander, and it often has this dark gray-brown color, but also usually has some lighter blue-gray and flecking on its side, some bright blue flecks on its side. The snout, if you notice, is a little bit narrower than the spotted salamander. Spotted salamanders have a very round head and a very round face with that big smile. The snout of the Jefferson salamander looks a little bit more pointed. It also has this long, laterally compressed tail, almost like a fish tail that looks squeezed or pinched. So you can see that long, that thin tail, and those really long toes as well. The Jefferson salamanders are laying fewer eggs than a spotted salamander, and they're laying eggs in a small loose mass that's always attached to sticks or vegetation and doesn't have that outer jelly matrix, so that when you go to pick them up out of the water, they have this kind of drippy quality where they're not all staying firmly together. The aquatic larvae look very similar to spotted salamander larvae, with those long limbs, that long broad tail as well, and those big bushy gills. And the juveniles, when they metamorphose and wander out onto the land, are sort of a gray or a green-brown with these light flecks on them. It's less frequently found in Vermont, and so it's a species of special concern. On the left, here's a look at the Jefferson salamander egg masses. These are quite a few different egg masses that are all on the same branch. So these are either several different masses laid by the same salamander, or several different salamanders laying egg masses all together on the same branch. But this is not one egg mass from one salamander. And you can see they all have this drippy quality where they're sort of falling off the branch as it's taken out of the water. Don't have that firm outer covering. Like the spotted salamander and other mole salamanders, the Jefferson salamander is living underground, and it's coming out only to feed or to migrate or to breed. Mole salamanders do come out from their underground hiding places, but it's often at night, on wet nights, so after rain, and they're coming out mainly just to find food. The Jefferson salamanders are one of our first species to migrate in the spring, and they're often even migrating over snow to get to their breeding pools, and some breeding pools may just barely be thawed or even have some ice still left on top of it. I've found Jefferson salamanders where they had migrated to a breeding pool, and then it had gotten cold again, and so there was a layer of ice over this whole top of this vernal pool, and yet we were still able to find Jefferson salamanders down underneath the ice. They'd gotten safely to the vernal pool, and they were just waiting it out for that for the warm weather to return and for the ice to melt again. The Jefferson salamanders are courting the females with some swimming displays. They're using those pheromones, and when they find her, they're going to clasp on to her. And the females are again collecting the spermatophore from the bottom of that pool. On the bottom, here's a couple examples of Jefferson salamanders, and both of those you can see that compressed tail. Some of them are a little bit lighter, so these are more lighter tan, but you can see sort of bluish tones, especially around where the limbs meet the body. And in the bottom picture there, it looks more like flecking. And you can see on the right in the map that the Jefferson salamander is is restricted more by elevation, so it's often found less than 1,000 feet. And so there are, in the Champlain Valley and the Connecticut River Valley, a lot of populations of these, but not along the spine of the Green Mountains or up in the Northeast Kingdom as much. And these Jefferson salamanders, the larvae are taking a couple months to develop and metamorphose, but they're a juvenile for about 3 years. So they're wandering around for about 3 years before they reach sexual maturity and find a breeding pool. The third mole salamander species in Vermont is the smallest one we have, the blue spotted salamander. They're really only getting to be about 5 inches in total length. And I should explain that 2 different length measurements we have on the top there is total length, TL, which is the tip of the snout to the tip of the tail, and also the snout vent length, or SVL. And that is from the tip of the snout to the vent, which in these salamanders is underneath them and just behind their back legs. That's where their cloaca is. And when you compare those 2 measurements, you're able to get an understanding of how long the salamander is overall, but also how long the body is compared to the tail. So if you were to subtract the snout vent length, the SVL, from the total length, you would get the length of the tail. It's a little bit tricky in some salamanders that may lose their tails. So we'll talk a little bit about some salamanders that can drop their tail, or their tail will fall off to avoid a predator. And in situations where that has happened and maybe the tail has yet to regrow fully, there may not be a difference between the total length and the snout vent length if it is still tailless. But back to the blue spotted salamander. The base color for these is a dark black, really much darker, say, than the Jefferson salamanders. And they have these bright blue spots, much brighter blue than the Jefferson salamanders. They also have a much smaller head than the other mole salamanders. And you can see that its tail is much shorter as well, and also rounded in cross section. So unlike that Jefferson salamander that had that really thin, laterally compressed tail, the blue spotted salamander's tail is much more round. And just like I was mentioning with the spotted salamanders, the males during the breeding season have a swollen vent, and these males are also much more brighter colored during the breeding season. So you may be able to tell the difference between a male and a female during the breeding season. The female is laying its eggs one at a time, and maybe in small groups, and attaching them to aquatic vegetation. And similarly, the newly metamorphosed juveniles, when they're out on land, are this kind of greenish brown color with some lighter flecking. The blue-spotted salamander is a species of special concern here in Vermont. And it's our smallest mole salamander, as I said, and similar habits to the other mole salamanders, living underground, migrating overland to get to the breeding pools. And they're most common in the Champlain Valley and the Connecticut River Valley, usually in forested wetlands and in floodplains. Here's a map of the range of the blue-spotted salamander. It's quite possible that there are more locations that have blue-spotted salamanders. They've just yet to be identified, particularly in places like the Connecticut River Valley and the upper Champlain Valley. It's likely there are more towns that have populations of blue-spotted salamanders. They just haven't been documented. And one tricky thing in documenting these is that they often hybridize with Jefferson salamanders. And you get these populations that have characteristics that are really intermediate of the two. So the salamander on the bottom there, you can see has some Jefferson salamander characteristics. It has a relatively big and rounder head. It has that laterally compressed tail, but it also has a lot of blue flecking, which is more characteristic of a blue-spotted salamander than a Jefferson salamander. And because 99% of these hybrids turn out to be females, the only real way to identify a pure blue-spotted salamander is when you have a male during the breeding season and it has a swollen vent at the base of the tail. Then you can say definitively that that is a male blue-spotted salamander. But a lot of these hybridized populations are females that have genes from both species of salamanders. And this can happen because these salamanders don't have two sets of genes like we humans have two sets of genes. They actually have three sets of genes. So there's a lot more going on genetically than the genetic diversity that happens, say, within humans. The last species of mole salamander hasn't actually been fully documented in Vermont, but it lives just south of us. So it is possible that mole salamander is in Vermont. It just hasn't been found yet. So I'll want to cover it anyways because it's likely that if they aren't here already, they will be soon. It's a smaller species of mole salamanders, and they have this beautiful, really black body that's sort of glossy looking with these silvery white bands that go across them. The aquatic larva looks similar to other mole salamander larvae, and they're laying their eggs singly but together in a clutch. And the eggs have a kind of clouded look to them. And unlike the other mole salamanders that are all mating and laying eggs in the spring, marbled salamanders are actually mating in the fall. And the females are laying their eggs in a depression, often underneath leaf litter, on the edge of a forested basin. And she's going to stay with her eggs. And in the spring, that basin is going to fill and become a vernal pool. And the eggs are going to hatch and swim around and go through their larval stage in the vernal pool. And the female is going to depart back into the forested upland. But the females know just where the edge of that vernal pool is and lay their eggs so that in the spring when it fills, those eggs will actually be underwater, even though in the fall when they lay them, there may not be any water in the forest. So we've looked at a couple different egg masses, and here's a little bit of a quiz for you. Here are 3 containers with 3 egg masses. 2 of them are from mole salamanders, and 1 of them is from a frog. I'll let you take a minute and figure out which is which. All right, here is the answer. On the left, we have a Jefferson salamander, or actually 2 Jefferson salamander egg masses. You can see they are fewer amount of eggs, they're attached to vegetation, and they don't have an outer matrix around them, so they aren't held really tightly together. If you were to pick them up, they'd have that drippy quality. In the middle is a spotted salamander egg mass. You can see there's a lot more eggs, and they're really densely packed together, and you can just barely see that there is an outer jelly matrix, although in this one the jelly matrix is transparent, making it a lot harder to see. Sometimes they're milky white, or if they have algae growth on them, you can see them really clearly. And then on the right is a wood frog egg mass, and there's a lot of eggs closely packed together, and there's no outer covering around that wood frog egg mass on the right. Moving on to our next group of salamanders, the lungless salamanders. The four-toed salamander is one of our smallest salamanders in Vermont, and it's one of the slender salamanders. They're really small, only getting up to 4 inches long, and as you can see, that SVL is only up to 2 inches long, so oftentimes the tail is making up at least half of the total body length. They have this beautiful rusty brown color, or grayish brown color on their back, and they have this intricate herringbone groove pattern. If you were to flip them over, you'll notice that they have a bright white belly with black spots all over it. Their skin appears really rough and granular, and they have a really squared off snout. You can also see a constriction in the bottom photo right at the base of the tail. And they have 4 toes on each of their hind foot where they get their name. The eggs are really small and sort of off-white, and if you find a clump of eggs together, you may confuse them with snail eggs, which look similar. The larvae are aquatic, and they're that same pond type, so they look structurally similar to the mole salamander larvae, although they have dark spots on the back of their head that kind of form together a Y. And this is an uncommon species in Vermont, and it's listed as a species of greatest conservation need. In the spring, four-toed salamanders are migrating from uplands forests where they've spent the winter underground, and they're going down to wetlands, primarily in the Champlain Valley, but also in the Connecticut River Valley. Wetland forests often have wet areas where down trees or rocks are growing sphagnum moss on top of them. And the females are crawling underneath that moss and laying their eggs. And they're laying a group of eggs, but females may also lay groups of eggs all together. And then one or several females will stay with that group of eggs and will actually guard them. And one reason for that bright white belly is when they're threatened by a predator, they'll actually roll over and show that bright white belly and perhaps scare away a predator like a shrew or a bird. So that's the evolutionary reason for that bright underside that they have. When the eggs hatch, they're going to wiggle through the moss and drop right into the water that's below or adjacent to that nest site. The larvae are feeding on small invertebrates, and then the juveniles, when they metamorphose, are going back uphill to their wintering spot, which is often underground in rodent tunnels or in these underground ledges that get below the frost line. And that constriction at the base of the tail is another amazing adaptation for for predator avoidance, where they can actually shed their tail. So some of the other lungless salamanders we're going to talk about, if their tail is pulled by a predator, their tail will come off. But the four-toed salamander can actually electively shed its tail. And when it drops its tail off, the tail will continue to wriggle around on its own and look very much like a worm, so that the four-toed salamander can either freeze in place and rely on camouflage while the predator takes its little tail snack and goes away, or it can scramble underneath a leaf. That tail bud will heal over, and eventually it may regrow a partial tail. On the right shows you that the range of the four-toed salamander is really restricted to the Champlain Valley and the Connecticut River Valley, though because the species is so small and so camouflaged, it's likely that there are many more sites, both in the Champlain Valley and the Connecticut River Valley, where it crosses roads at night, but just hasn't been found yet. So if you're doing a nighttime road crossing, it's really easy to see that big, brightly colored spotted salamander, but it's a lot harder to see this little tiny camouflaged four-toed salamander. One that sometimes gets confused with the four-toed salamander is another one of our lungless salamanders, the eastern red-backed salamander, named, of course, for its brick red stripe that runs down the center of its back. It's a little bit longer than the four-toed salamanders, reaching about 4 inches total length, and it's really slender. It's one of our 3 slender salamanders, and similarly it has that adaptation where its tail will come off if pulled by a predator. It has this beautiful stripe down its back, but also these kind of gray mottled sides, gray speckled sides, and it also has this kind of belly that's lighter but speckled with black and gray and white, similar to the sides. There are also several different color morphs. So the red-backed color morph that you see in these 3 photos is the most common, although there is also a lead-backed morph that lacks that red stripe altogether, so it looks uniformly slate gray. And then there is a erythristic morph, which is all red, and it's very bright red and can be confused with an eastern newt or a small spring salamander. There's also a color morph that instead of a red stripe lacks some of that red pigment and so has a lighter brown stripe and can be confused with the northern two-line salamander. All of the salamanders I just mentioned we'll look at a little bit later and compare them to this eastern redback salamander. Again, it has these small yellow eggs that are laid in a cluster, usually underneath a rock or inside a rotten log. Because they're terrestrial, this is our only salamander that is not going to water at all in its life, and it's laying its eggs not related to water. So they're in a very moist environment underneath a rock or inside a rotten log where it's going to stay moist because the larvae are going to develop inside the egg. And when they hatch from the egg, they're already in their juvenile phase and they look like a tiny adult. So you can find these little tiny eastern redback salamanders. These are juveniles that are probably have hatched that year or maybe are a year old. They haven't reached sexual maturity yet, but they came out of the egg looking like a tiny little adult red-backed salamander. This salamander is one of the most abundant vertebrate animals in the eastern forest. They're found everywhere. And so sometimes people see these at road crossings in the spring. They're not actually migrating to a breeding pool. It's just that there are so many of them on the landscape that they're often moving around all the time. They are living underneath logs and in the leaf litter, and they are coming out at night on wet nights to forage and then going back down, but they're often found not far underneath um, the surface of the land. So they might be just underneath rocks or underneath woody debris. And the photo on top there is showing two redback salamanders that are the lead phase, so they don't have their red backs. And below is one of the erythristic morphs that is that bright red, uniformly red color. Because these color morphs are genetic traits, oftentimes you find a population that has the same color morph. So if you find one erythristic redback salamander, it's likely that there are other ones around in the same area. And they are, as I said, one of the most abundant form of biomass in the forest, and they are more than 1 square meter throughout much of its range. Because it's so abundant in our forests, it serves a really important role in taking the tiny invertebrates, things like slugs and millipedes and other small creatures living in the leaf matter, and converting it to a larger form of prey that can in turn be eaten by things like snakes and birds and mammals. So it's really important in terms of the flow of energy through our ecosystem, in taking that tiny little invertebrate prey and making it into something that's available for larger predators as well. And you can see from the map on the right, it's found in every town in Vermont. A couple towns where it hasn't been confirmed yet, but we know it's definitely there. A relative of the eastern redback salamander is the northern slimy salamander. This is one that, again, hasn't been confirmed in Vermont, so it's hypothetical, but it occurs in 3 of our neighboring states. So it's possible that it's here in southern Vermont. It just hasn't been confirmed yet. It's a larger salamander, it growing to a snout vent length of 3.5 inches, so several inches overall larger than our eastern redback salamander. And you can see that it has a heavier body than the redback salamander and that really thick round tail. Its body is this darker slate gray overall with these bright white flecks. They are also terrestrial, and they're laying eggs in a rotting stump, usually every other year. Just like the redback salamanders, the juveniles hatch as tiny versions of the adults, and they're taking 4 to 5 years for them to grow to the size where they'll reach sexual maturity. These salamanders are tied closely with talus slopes, and they don't move very far. So oftentimes you'll find a really dense population, an area that has just the right habitat for them. You'll find a lot of them, but if you were to go a half mile down the road, you may not find any. Another one of our lungless salamanders is one of our stream-dwelling salamanders, the northern dusky salamander. This is a really chunky-looking, medium-sized salamander, and it is sort of this grayish-brown overall, often sometimes getting to the chocolatey brown, a darker chocolatey brown, and sometimes having these lighter tan brown stripes down their back as well. It's a really heavy-bodied salamander, and you can see from this picture it has much larger and stronger back legs than it does forelegs. It has this costal grooves, these really distinct costal grooves, so those are the grooves you see on the side of the salamander, and a strong ventral line, so that line down the back. So you can see it has those grooves on its sides, but also that line down its back as well. Its head is shaped rather like a spade, so sort of like a shovel shaped head, and it has a light line you can see that goes from the eye to the back angle of the mouth. Its tail is also slightly laterally compressed and has almost a triangular appearance if you were to look at it in cross section. Its larvae are a stream type. So as opposed to a pond type, these stream type larvae have really long bodies, long thin bodies with long laterally compressed tails, and they have these external gills as well. But if you were to take them out of the water, the external gills kind of fall against the body. So when you pick them up out of the water, you won't be able to see the external gills until they're in the water and can kind of puff out. The juveniles have a line of spots on their back that sometimes fuse into a stripe, and they're fairly common throughout Vermont where the right habitat exists. They're living in saturated soils near streams or seepages in forests. They really like dark, shady spots in mature forests where there's kind of that closed canopy above. So there's not a lot of light getting way down to their stream. So these streams tend to be cold, and the stream is usually really slow flowing. So perhaps a trickle or a seepage area where the water's not really running so much as there is a wet hillside. And they're underneath, usually underneath rocks or underneath woody debris. And they're laying their eggs underneath moss or woody debris right adjacent to the stream or the seep. The females are staying with their eggs and they're guarding them until they hatch. And this is a salamander that can move really quickly and can even jump or bite to avoid predators, which is something that we experienced with one of these salamanders with a summer camper. We were in a place that was perfect habitat for dusky salamanders, and we found a rather large dusky salamander. A camper picked it up and was holding it, and the dusky salamander bit the palm of this camper. And the camper was quite surprised and called out. And I don't think it was causing him pain, but it was more of a surprise. And so the salamander was actually sort of suction cupped or latched on to this camper's palm. And it took a couple minutes for us to put the camper's hand into the water and gently coax the salamander off. Both the camper and the salamander were fine, but just so you know that dusky salamanders may bite if they are stressed. They're active year-round, and you're more likely to find them in the late spring and early summer and also the fall. In the hot summer, in the later summer, their stream beds may start to dry down, and they'll actually go down further underground into the stream bed where there's more soil saturation. And in the wintertime, they're also going down into the stream bed to stay away from ice. But you can find them year-round in Vermont. They're active year-round, and if you have a stream that is free of ice, even in January or February, you can turn over rocks and sometimes find northern dusky salamanders. Here's an example of really prime habitat for a northern dusky salamander, and you can see how well it blends in to this really kind of muddy, seepy area. And you can also see that strong ventral line, that line down its back, and how that tail is a little bit triangular shaped. Also those sort of vertical costal grooves on its side. It's been found in most communities in Vermont, and I would guess that a lot of those places that it hasn't been found, either in the Champlain Valley, lack a lot of good habitat for this animal, and some of the places in the Northeast just haven't been surveyed well enough yet. One very similar salamander is the Allegheny Mountain dusky salamander. This is a close cousin to the northern dusky salamander, and they actually hybridize. This is one that is hypothetical in Vermont. It hasn't been fully documented here, but occurs very closely here in northern New York. But it's believed that the eastern boundary for this species is sort of the Hudson River and Lake Champlain. So there's a big hurdle for this species to cross to get to Vermont, but it is possible that it could be here, perhaps in the southern part of the state, like the Taconics. Very similar to our dusky salamander, our northern dusky salamander structurally, but also can look very similarly to our northern two-line salamander. So some difference are when we were talking about the tail of the northern dusky salamander looking a little bit compressed and triangular in cross-section. This tail is much more rounded. So if you were to look at it in cross-section, it's round. And differently from the northern two-line salamander, the Allegheny Mountain dusky salamander has white underneath its tail. The two-line salamander has bright yellow under its tail. So if you think you may have one, you can look primarily at the tail, looking at the shape of the tail, is it round, and looking underneath, is it white underneath the tail. Our northern two-line salamander is another one of our 3 stream-dwelling salamanders and another one of our 3 slender salamanders. Looking at the total length compared to the snout vent length, you can see that it has a very long tail compared to its body. It's very slender with a very long tail. And the adults have a kind of tan brown back, and as you fade into the tail, the back goes from being tan brown to this sort of brighter golden almost colored tail. On either side of their back, where their back meets their side, there are 2 thin black stripes that start at the eye and extend through the tail. The front and hind limbs are equally thin, so unlike the dusky salamander that have those really thick back legs, these legs are the same front and back, and it has a very round looking snout. Its larvae are that same stream type with a much longer, thinner body, and have 2 parallel rows of light spots on a mottled brown back. This is a species that's relatively common throughout Vermont. It prefers the wet soil on the edge of colder, fast-flowing brooks and streams, less oftenly found in seeps and springs, and it may be found in those places when it has ventured away from its waterway. It's the only stream-dwelling salamander that we have in Vermont that is found in waterways without canopy cover. So if you have a brook that runs through a field or a pasture, you're less likely to find other stream-dwelling salamanders, but turning over rocks, you may find the two-line salamander there. And it may move over land, especially on wet nights when it's out foraging. It can go several hundred feet away from its stream. And so you may find this species in habitat that looks more like eastern red-backed salamander habitat, but there's probably a stream relatively close that it came from. And the adults can actually climb trees a little bit when they're out searching for their prey at night. The females are laying their eggs underneath a rock that's in the water, and they're actually attaching it to the underside of the rock. And when they hatch, they're an aquatic larva for a few years. And sometimes you can find a lot of larvae in a small area, usually just resting in the quiet pool on the edge of a stream. On the left, there's a picture of a larva. That larva is probably an inch to an inch and a half long, and you can see those rows of lighter, small, sort of oval-shaped spots on its back, and that sort of squared-off snout. And there's an egg mass as well. It's actually eggs that are laid individually, sort of all together in a clump, and that was underneath a rock. So when you're looking for these salamanders during the breeding season, also look underneath rocks for egg masses. And you can see it's been documented in just about every community in Vermont near these fast-flowing streams. The largest of our stream-dwelling salamanders, and my favorite salamander, is the spring salamander. This is a really large salamander, getting up to around 8 inches long. It's really heavy-bodied with these really noticeable costal grooves on its side, this laterally compressed tail, and these these lighter lines that extend from the eye to its nostril. Their legs are really thick, and they're really good at walking along the side of a stream. But that tail, that really muscular, laterally compressed tail, means that they can swim really fast as well. Their larvae are a stream-type larva, so with a longer, thinner body and still a chunkier head, that are kind of sandy colored, a pale tan with some mottling, and these tiny light spots on its face, and a very squared off snout. They're relatively common in Vermont, where there are these cold, clear streams or springs, because they require this well-oxygenated water. So they're often underneath larger flat rocks in the smaller stream beds, and they're laying their eggs right underneath these rocks. They actually sort of do a handstand, turning their bodies over when they're laying their eggs, and pressing their cloaca, the females pressing their cloaca up onto the underside of these rocks to lay their eggs. On rainy nights, you can take a flashlight into a stream and actually see spring salamanders foraging along the edges of the stream for prey. They're taking a wide variety of invertebrate prey in the water and next to the stream, but they're also regularly eating the aquatic larvae of northern dusky and northern two-line salamanders, or even larval spring salamanders. And because of this, the northern dusky and northern two-line salamanders, when they're juveniles, may spend time really on the edge of the stream, or even venturing out a little bit onto land to avoid these large spring salamanders that are in the water and are likely to eat them. When they're stressed, they secrete this really thick mucus, so they can be hard to handle. And they're really found throughout the state where habitat exists, usually near mountains, which is where you get those fast-flowing streams that they like. And that's reflected pretty well in their range. They're also not terribly well surveyed for, because you really have to work to find them. So it's likely that they're found in other communities throughout Vermont. They just haven't been fully documented yet. Here's an example of two different sizes of spring salamander larvae. So you can see that sort of sandy tan body overall with that squared snout and those really light white spots on their head. You can also see, because these two are in water, those external gills extending out from the back of either side of the head. Moving on to our one species of newt, the eastern newt is a medium-sized salamander that is growing up to 5 inches long. The adults most people are familiar with, that have this olive green back with this line of red dots that are bordered in black. And if you turn it over, it has a much more yellow belly. They also have this really thin, vertically compressed tail that allows them to swim because the adults are fully aquatic. The males have larger hind legs. So on the left picture, you can see a male whose hind legs are much bigger than its forelegs. And the larvae are these pond-type larvae that have the really sort of bigger head and smaller thin body with pale greenish light spots on their sides and a dark line that runs through their eye. This is a common species that's found throughout the state, living in ponds and lakes. Eastern newts have an amazing life cycle. So they're laying their eggs in the water. Females are laying one egg at a time, up to 350 of them, and attaching them to aquatic vegetation. After they hatch, they are those pond-type larvae that are living for several weeks while they develop, eating zooplankton and invertebrate larvae in the pond. And then they're having a metamorphosis where they become these terrestrial red Fs. And for several years, these Fs are living entirely on land. The orange coloring is a warning to predators because they are actually toxic. They have toxins in their skin. And so they're wandering just around on land and they're dispersing. They're finding new ponds separate from the pond they were born in. And it takes them several years to reach sexual maturity. Once they do reach sexual maturity, they're finding a pond. Usually they're preferring newly formed ponds, like beaver ponds are ideal, but they'll use man-made ponds as well. And once they reach sexual maturity and get to that body of water, they're going to transform into that olive-colored adult, and they're going to stay there for the rest of their life. And they can live for several decades. They're found throughout the state, and those few places in the Northeast where they have yet to be documented, they're likely there, they just haven't been fully documented yet. The last salamander is our largest salamander and perhaps the least well known in our state, the mud puppy. These amazing animals are usually about a foot long but can grow up to 19 inches long. As an adult, they have these kind of brownish gray or tan bodies with these dark spots all over. They have a thin, laterally compressed tail, and the adults retain their gills. So usually larval salamanders, when they metamorphose, they lose their gills. Here, mud puppies have retained those external gills when they reach sexual maturity. If you flipped it over, its underside is a lot more pale and mottled, and the males during the breeding season have that swollen cloaca. The larvae are really amazingly colored, where they have these broad black stripes alternating with yellow-tan bands. And mud puppies have 4 toes on their hind feet, unlike most salamanders, which have 5. It's a species of special concern in Vermont, and in fact, it's been proposed to be listed as threatened several times, but it has yet to gain that status and level of protection. On the left, you can see a picture of one of the larvae with those dark stripes alternating with those tan bands. It's found in big waterways, deep cold lakes, large weedy ponds, and big slow rivers. So in Vermont, that's Lake Champlain, it's the Connecticut River, it's major tributaries of those, and also some of the deeper lakes and ponds near those two river water systems, those two watersheds. The adults are often spending their times near the edges where there's a lot of things to eat, like crayfish. They're often hiding underneath the rocks. They'll take insects, they'll eat mollusks, they'll eat crayfish, they'll eat frogs or other salamanders, and they'll also eat fish. They're very hard to find because they're entirely aquatic. They're never coming out onto land, so you have to go there to find them. And they are found regularly by people fishing, particularly people fishing through the ice in wintertime may accidentally hook a mud puppy. And although it's not usually a good outcome for the mud puppy, it has led to some valuable insights about where these animals live because they are hard to survey for. They're laying their eggs underneath a rock or a submerged log, and they're reaching their sexual maturity once they're getting to be about 8 inches long, which is around 5 years of age. And you can see from the map on the right that they are really restricted to the Lake Champlain Basin and the Connecticut River Basin. They have been found in several different waterways within those two basins, areas such as Lake Moray and Fairleigh, but they are tied pretty closely to those areas. It's possible that they exist in other spots within those areas, but again, they're really hard to survey for, so we don't know very much about their range within Vermont. Just to go back through our salamanders and think of them in a different way, in Vermont we have 3 small and slender salamanders. So these are long, thin salamanders. On the left, with that bright white belly and that black flecking, also that constriction at the base of its tail, is our 4-toed salamander. That's our smallest salamander at its maximum adult length. In the middle, rolled over so you can't see its diagnostic red back, that mottled black and tan belly, is our eastern redback salamander. And on the right, with that really bright yellow underneath its tail, is a northern two-line salamander. Moving up in size, we have 3 sort of mid-sized salamanders. These are a little bit longer, maybe up to 5 inches long, and a little bit thicker as well. In the top is our newt. There's an adult eastern newt. In the middle, with those costal grooves down the side and that line down its back, also those really heavy back legs compared to its forelegs, and that shovel-shaped head, is our northern dusky salamander. And on the bottom, with that bright blue flecking on a black body, is our blue spotted salamander. Moving up in size are 4 large salamanders. These are getting to be anywhere from 6 to 8 inches long. They're really sturdy bodied and they're impressive looking. So on top is our spotted salamander with those bright yellow spots. Next down with that sort of salmony orange color is our spring salamander. Third one down with that sort of grayish color, grayish brown color, and that laterally compressed tail is the Jefferson salamander. And on the bottom is one of those hybrids between a blue spotted and a Jefferson salamander. And the last class of salamander we have is one really big salamander. There's nothing that this could be mistaken for at its full adult length, more than 12 inches long, with that laterally compressed tail, those external gills behind its head. The mud puppy is really an amazing animal. And with that, I want to show you a kind of an example of salamanders all found in one small area. So this was an area where there was a pond and a stream right next to each other at the Birds of Vermont Museum. You have on the left a northern two-line salamander. Next to the right is a northern dusky salamander, then an eastern redback salamander, an eastern newt, and all the way on the right is a northern dusky salamander that is in the process of regrowing its tail. So there we have 5 salamanders that were all found in the same area. And with that, we've been through all of the salamanders of Vermont. I hope you enjoy getting out and finding some of these amazing animals.